Hey everyone, today we're actually going to cover three chapters in the textbook at once. This is 20 slides long. I'm going to do my best to get through it as quickly as possible, but there are some very important ideas and terms to know, so I would encourage you to take some notes throughout our discussion, and we're going to try to do this as quickly as possible. The last chapter is on textual analysis, which will lead into our rhetorical analysis paper, which is the next paper you have to do. All right. But for now, let's start off with just some things to know about experimental research, right? So we've ran through variables, etc. Now we're going to talk about some of the ways in which we just need to be mindful of the methods involved with research so that we can assess whether or not that research is valid, right? So again, we're looking through methods and making sure that methods are sound, because methods that aren't sound are going to give us bad results. All right, so one of the first things that I really like to go over with people when we're talking about, the validity of methods, is just understanding that there's a difference between theories and facts. All right, so facts are concrete. We've talked about this before, right? Facts are concrete, they're measurable, right? And everybody looks at a fact and they agree upon the fact. So you can measure it, right? You can have statistics for certain things. Theories are explanations as to why those facts exist. All right, and I'll give you some example down here. We'll go over this idea of like male privilege here in a second, and why it's a theory, but it's not necessarily a fact, and the distinction is important. All right, so first and foremost, let's talk about universal laws. Universal laws are conditions that will always follow a pattern, right? So things like gravity, right? As a researcher, you are not discovering universal laws, all right? These, most likely, like these are groundbreaking, paradigmatic shifting moments in history when universal laws are discovered. You're not figuring those out, right? What you're most likely finding and you're trying to put your finger on are what are known as statistical laws. I mean, if we're going to be honest real quick, I don't even like the fact that they're called laws. I wish they were just called like statistical probability. What you are looking for when you're doing research is you're trying to be able to say a statement like the following. All right, based on the results I found, conditions will have a blank % chance of happening given a certain pattern. All right, so if you listen to a speech by, such and such presidential candidate, it's likely that you'll be persuaded. So you use terms like statistically probable, it's likely, but there's always a chance that it's not going to happen. With universal laws, it's definitely always happening. With statistical laws, you're looking at the probability that something will happen based on the manipulation of various variables, all right? So as a researcher, you're dealing in statistical probability. The closer you can get that number to 100%, you're never going to reach 100%, right? But the closer you can get that number to 100%, sort of the more sound your methods are, all right? So we've gone over this idea of fact versus theory before, right? But just as another example, right? Anytime we have these discussions on like privilege, there are discussions that have been mainstreamed in the last couple years. I am, let's say, disappointed with the ways in which some academics who discuss this stuff talk about it on like cable news shows, because they act as if it's some sort of universal law. When in reality, what it is it's a statistical probability theoretical explanation for disparities between groups. So if you take people and you divide them up by demographics, there are differences between groups. There are differences amongst educational attainment. There's differences in crime statistics and prison incarceration. There's differences with height and weight. There's differences in athletic abilities, right? There's differences with regard to, the different types of people that will play different sports, right? So there's differences, across the spectrum with regard to whatever category you want to put people in, based on their sex, based on gender identity, based on their age, based on their race, based on their ethnicity, based on their class, economic background, right? There are differences between groups, all right? However, this is important. Privilege is not a concrete fact that is measurable. When people talk about this idea of privilege, what they're talking about is the statistical probability that some sort of universal discrimination exists in order to make things, better for some people and not better for other people, right? We'll get into alternative causal variables on the next slide here, but for now, just sort of know, if we just take male privilege, for instance, right? It's not a universal law, right? When people talk about male privilege, for instance, what they're trying to do is come up with a theory to describe current disparities between men and women, let's say, with regard to educational attainment or income earnings across the job market, right? So on average, men make more money, and you could say, well, that's an example of male privilege. And it's like, well, there's a lot of other variables such as hours worked and careers that they're going into with regard to the major that they chose in college, right? Family structure definitely plays a big role in why women are more likely to take more time off, right, for family reasons as opposed to men, et cetera, right? So people do research to argue the statistical probability that privilege is one of the factors driving, let's say, the wage gap, right? But as with any other sociological phenomenon, there's usually lots and lots of complex variables that drive various disparities or set up our culture the way it is, right? So it could be, right, that men are privileged in one way with regard to the wage gap, but it could also be things like the major that was chosen, right? The amount of hours worked in a week, right? So that's a different variable. How many hours do you work in a week? It could be childcare obligations, right? So now we're already up to like 4 different variables that factor into a more complex problem, and we're trying to explain the disparity. We can measure the disparity. Men make X amount of money, women make Y amount of money, right? And the theoretical explanation is like, why is this happening? And we try to come up with different reasons as to why this is happening, all right? So just know the difference between theory and fact. We've gone over it before, but it's worth repeating. Okay, so here we get alternative causal argument, which will, causality argument. We'll talk about this in a moment. All right, correlation versus causation we've gone over. Correlated just means that 2 variables move in the same direction, but they're not linked to each other. They don't cause one another to happen. So you could have what we call a spurious relationship, which means that just things happen by chance at the same time. All right. So for instance, it rains in London, and then tomorrow at the New York Stock Exchange, the stock goes up. You're like, okay, the rain didn't cause stocks to go up, right? Because some days it rains, some days it doesn't. So there's just, it's spurious, it's coincidental, it happens by chance. Some people get superstitious about the stock market, though, right? And they start looking at things that are not related to the stock market, that do not cause the stock market to go up or down, and they act as if it does. Lots of us do this if we're sports fans, right? If you're watching a certain, your favorite sports team, you might want to wear your favorite jersey for a football game or your favorite socks. If you have your buddies over for the games, I have friends who are like really superstitious about like what order you have to sit on the couch, right? Otherwise, your favorite player is going to drop a pass in a football game, right? The Philadelphia Eagles don't care if you're wearing your favorite socks or your favorite jersey or what order you are sitting in on your couch, right? They don't care. It's not going to affect the game, right? But people think that these spurious relationships are causal when really they might just be correlated. It's a coincidence that every time you wear, your Carson Wentz jersey, I guess he doesn't play for them anymore, but every time you wear your whoever an Eagles player is jersey, like they win the game. It's just happenstance, all right? Alternative causality arguments, right? What this means is that sometimes we see things happening on the surface and we think that's the driving variable, but really there's all these things underneath that are alternative variables that actually cause that actually cause the event to take place. All right. So did your treatment really cause the change, or did something else cause the change? All right. Now this gets a little controversial, as it should. All right. But sort of like the most egregious controversial examples are the best way to explain things sometimes. All right. So for instance, in the early 1990s, crime was going down in New York City, right? And people started to figure out, like, we're trying to figure out, what was the causal argument, right? What was causing crime to go down, right? And different people had different explanations as to why crime was going down. So some people were saying, well, it was better policing, right? We put more police in the streets. People are less likely to commit crimes. If you start arresting people for minor crimes, then that doesn't snowball into larger crimes. It's known as the broken window theory. You might have heard this in like a sociology class. Long story short, the broken window theory is if you take a car and you put that car on a neighborhood block, all right, and you just leave it there, right? If then you leave it there for a week, nothing happens. Week number 2, you come in and you break one window out of that car. All right, and they say, okay, what's going to happen? What people started to find when they do this experiment is like they come back the next day and like the researcher breaks one window in the car, and then they come back the next day and then all the car windows are broken, and then they come back the next week and the hood's dented, and they come back the week after that and all the tires are gone, and soon this sort of destruction of property starts to go from like just this one car to the car on either side of it, right? And then that goes into like breaking windows on the houses on the block, right? It goes to littering in the streets, right? It goes to putting, tagging, right? Graffiti on the walls, right? And so this was the broken window theory, was that if you keep your neighborhood safe and don't allow that first incident of criminal activity to go unchecked, that keeps everything nice and in order, right? So if some like little 15-year-old kid, right, comes up and breaks a window on a car, it's like you got to punish that kid, because if you don't, then the next time, like somebody a little bit older is going to come in and do a little bit more damage, a little bit more damage. Like it just sort of like spreads out until, breaking a car window is not a big deal. But eventually, if that starts spreading, now you're getting into things like drug activity, gang activity, you start getting into violence, et cetera, right? Crime starts to escalate in neighborhoods that aren't organized and taking care of themselves. Okay, so some people are saying, well, it was better policing, right? Rudy Giuliani just put more cops in, right? Some people are saying it has to do with family structure, right? So family structure is a pretty good predictor as to whether or not someone's going to engage in crime, right? So individuals who are from single-parent households are more likely to engage in criminal activity than people who are in intact two-parent households where the biological mom and dad are both raising the child, right? And that gets really important when you talk about like, divorce statistics and step parents and all this other kind of stuff, right? So people are saying, well, family structure is important to keeping crime down, and some people say, well, it's not, right? Economic opportunities. So when a lot of jobs are available, people say, well, if kids, right, because most crime is committed by young men, if jobs are available, then kids aren't going to start, hanging out on the street corner, engaging in, stupid activities. Instead, they're going to be going to work. So if you want to get rid of crime, you have to make sure that there's economic opportunities going on. Some people say, look, crime goes down when there's expanded gun ownership. You look at areas where everybody's carrying a gun, right? Go out to Wyoming, it's like very low crime because, if I, walk up on somebody, I don't know if they have a gun or not. And so some people say that increased gun ownership actually reduces crime because it makes everybody would-be criminals. It makes them act very, very polite because they don't know whether or not the person that they're about to rob is packing heat. But the long and short of it is that people argue all the time about why crime is down, right? What we do know, what we see on the surface is that crime goes up or down, and then the alternative causality is what's the variable driving the lower crime, right? And it could be a plethora. It could be economic downturn. It could be family structure. It can be more police. It could be less police. It could be gun ownership. It could be a whole host of variables. So you don't want to be that researcher who focuses in on just like, let's just change one variable and everything's going to be better. It's usually a large combination of a lot of variables that lead to disparities or crime going up or down, right? We go back to the last slide. We think about something like, the wage gap between men and women. You sometimes get those researchers who are just like, it's because of the patriarchy, right? It's just like, that's the one thing. It's just like discrimination against women is the only thing that's driving it. I don't, I'm always skeptical of people who find a singular causal variable to explain all of these complicated processes, right? I will give people their due and say, look, like that could be one factor, right? Discrimination between male and female candidates could be one factor. But there's a whole host of all these other alternative causality variables that are also in play, and to just ignore it and just say like, it's a patriarchy, it's always a patriarchy. It's a very lazy argument, all right? So you want to make sure that you're open to exploring other variables. Finally, just, intoxicant use. People like track like how much drugs and alcohol people are consuming and whether or not that leads to more or less crime. I mean, there's some interesting statistics out there with regard to like murder, for instance. Like anytime someone is killed, at least one person involved, either the person who got killed or the person doing the killing, was, excessively drinking, right? Alcohol is usually involved in a lot of when violent crime happens. Now, you could say, like, we're not saying alcohol causes people to be violent, but you could say it's a little bit like people want to be violent, and they need a little shot of liquor to sort of get that liquid courage in order to sort of carry out the deed, for instance. All right. So there's all these there's all these variables we want to look at, right? All right, so here's a fun little interesting statistic you can look at as far as like what's the number one predictor of a child's academic success, right? You could, like, this is one thing I'm obviously interested in because I'm in the education sector, right? People look at things like teachers unions and more money in the schools, and we need lunch programs, and we need this and that. And they're always looking at like schools and schools and schools and money and schools and unions and schools and more teachers in schools, right? But really, like, the number one predictor of a child's academic success, is what they found as a variable is the amount of books that are in the child's household as that child grows up, right? Now, just books being around a child doesn't mean that that child is learning by osmosis. They're just like laying in a crib of books and they just absorb the material. But what it indicates is that if there's a lot of books in the house, it indicates that the parents probably read. And if there's books in the house, it means the parents care about reading. They're probably also reading to their kids. And if you're reading to your kids, the more words a kid hears out of a book before they get to kindergarten, the more prepared they are, sort of going, as far as learning opportunities through school. So you want to make, these are more variables to look at, right? Also think, again, like you go back to like something like family structure is a big predictor of child's academic success, right? If mom has to get up, and if it's a single mom, she has to get up at 6 a.m. to go work, you know, kids it's hard for a kid to get, himself or herself ready for school on their own. So two parents just sort of cuts that workload in half as far as attentiveness, helping with homework, etc. Right? If mom doesn't get home till later, and that's the only parent in the house, it's, somebody needs help with their homework. It's hard to sort of split up those parental duties. If there's only one parent involved, right? So this is another big predictor that people look at when it comes to education. A lot of education success like starts at the home, and throwing more money at schools. It doesn't show that there's much of a relationship between more money or less money involved in schools as to whether or not kids are actually going to get educated. So much of whether or not a kid gets a good education has to do with the child's home life. Okay, who are you testing? You have three different groups. You don't want to tell people what group they're in, obviously, because it could manipulate. But you have three different groups. Let's start with this one. First, you have the control group, which is the part of the population you don't do anything to them, right? It's like you just go keep living your life, all right? So let's say you're doing something with diet and exercise. You say like, hey, you want to be a part of the study? And they're like, yeah. And it's like, cool. Can I weigh you? Can I put you on a scale? I'll test your BMI. Just keep doing what you're doing. I'm not going to tell you to do anything. Just keep living your life. And they're like, okay, all right. That's the control group. You have the test group, which is the people receiving the treatment, and then you have the placebo group. Now, the test group and the placebo group both know that they are a part of the study. The control group knows, but they don't get anything, so they don't care. The test group and the placebo group both think that they're getting something involved with the study. And the reason that it's important that both of them think they're getting some sort of extra attention or extra manipulation with regard to your study is because there is something called the placebo effect. So if you say you're doing like a diet pill, all right, you give both these you give the test group and the placebo group a pill every day. The placebo group might just get a sugar tablet, right? And you tell them like, we're doing something on fitness and exercise. Here's a diet pill, take it. The test group's getting the actual diet pill. The placebo group is getting like nothing, right? They're getting like a sugar pill, which doesn't do anything. But you actually want to test them because the placebo group might mentally be affected by taking the pill, and they might be changing other parts of their behavior because they think that they're supposed to be engaged in some sort of exercise study, right? So the placebo effect is something important to look at when you're doing research. There are ways in which people change and manipulate their behavior because they just change their mindset, right? So a lot of psychology does a lot of these types of studies where they're like, we're not going to actually give people any, special pills. We're not going to manipulate their life. We're just going to tell them we're manipulating their life. And people can make a lot of progress if you just tell them that you're manipulating their life, but you're actually doing nothing, right? People change their lifestyle a lot when they just think that some sort of intervention has happened. All right. Why is it important to have each of these three groups? Obviously, because they're testing different ways. The control group, you just want to see what the average person is going to do. Let's say it's a 6-month trial. You want to see if the average person is going to lose weight or not lose weight. The placebo group, again, you want to make sure, if it's happening in their head, or you have a test group. If that test group is making more progress than the placebo group, then you're like, oh, the pill's working. Now, this is what could happen sometimes, all right, as far as testing all these groups. You could do some sort of diet pill study, and the placebo group, let's say that they lose 10 pounds, and the test group also loses 10 pounds. Now you're in a situation where like, well, the test group lost 10 pounds, but you can't claim that it was because of your pill, because the placebo group also lost 10 pounds. So for both of these groups, it's like maybe your pill was garbage and your pill didn't work at all, but both groups had some sort of mental interaction with thinking that they were on some sort of magic diet pill, and so both groups lost weight. So it's actually important to trace that to see, did my pill actually cause people to lose weight, or was it more of a psychological effect? And if the placebo group had just as much progress as the test group, then you can't say that your pill did anything, right? Now, what could happen is the placebo group might lose 10 pounds, and maybe the test group that actually took your diet pill, they lost 20 pounds, right? And you're like, okay, so we're at a net plus 10 as far as weight loss here. So my pill did something. My pill was probably not responsible for all 20 pounds, but I could probably say with good accuracy that my pill was responsible for at least 10 pounds of that weight loss. All right. So that's why you want to make sure that you're testing all three groups. All right, how are you testing people? We've talked about random sample, right? Test, control, placebo. Assign people to groups randomly. Otherwise, what might happen sometimes, inadvertently or unconsciously, you might put people who are similar in the same group. So again, you don't want to put all men in the test group and all women in the control group, right? So male and female bodies react differently to various chemicals, for instance. So if you're doing some sort of medical study, you want to make sure that it's random. Because male and female hormone levels at different age groups are going to react to it differently, right? So age groups, you don't want to put all the old people in one, like in the test group, and all the young people in the placebo group, because age could affect it, all right? So you want to make sure that you are randomly assigning, people to groups. Double blind, just know what this term means. All double blind means is that if I'm the head researcher, I'm going to get my research assistant to actually administer the test. And my research assistant has no idea what's going on, except I tell them, like, put these people in these groups and give them these pills. But my research assistant doesn't know what pills they're getting, doesn't know what tests they're getting, right? And the reason you do that is because I, as a researcher, I might give hints unknowingly when people give the correct response. So I get a research assistant, and they know, I just give them instructions as to how to read questions, but I don't tell them what I'm actually looking for in these questionnaires, right? So we go back to like the questionnaire stuff we talked about last time. If I'm reading a list of questions off and you give me the right answer that I'm like looking for that tests my hypothesis, I might smile, I might get elated, right? If I have a research assistant, they don't know what the hell I'm looking for. They're just like, why is Josh doing this? I don't know what this research is about. I'm just going to read these questions to the person, and Josh will look at the answers, but my research assistant is not going to give any hints as to what the right answer might be, because they don't know what's going on either. All right. So that's what double blind means, is that you put an extra researcher in between the person who put the experiment together and the participant, because you don't want my nonverbal biases coming through. Pre-test, post-test, pretty self-explanatory if anything changed, right? So if you have a group of 50 people, I want to test their communication skills. I could test at the beginning of the semester, excuse me. I could teach them a class on public speaking, give them a test afterwards, and see if anything changed. Are they better public speakers? Now, there are situations where you can only do a post-test because an event has happened that was unpredicted, right? So the example given in the book is in the 1980s, the Challenger space shuttle disaster happened. So we were sending up a rocket into space, and shortly after takeoff, it blew up. Ronald Reagan gives his, the Challenger speech. You can look it up. Pretty well-known event in the 1980s for anyone who was around. we couldn't give a pre-test because we didn't know the Challenger was going to explode, but we could give a post-test. And what happened was the government individuals went around and they gave a lot of post-tests to people with regard to like how they felt about the space program, right? You can only guess how people felt about NASA, for instance, before the space shuttle blew up. But they were going around just to kind of figure out like, do people want to keep doing this NASA thing? Like, are we spending too much money? Is it worth it? We've just lost lives, like trying to send people up into space. It was a pretty dramatic, terrible situation. So you can only do a post test and you can only guess how people feel about NASA beforehand. Now, when I mean guess, like you could ask somebody like before the Challenger blew up, how did you feel about NASA? But then you get in this sort of like bias, like this confirmation bias, where people like might give you the answer they think you want to hear. And now that Challenger is blown up, like you can't really remove that emotion from me because I can't go back in time and act like the Challenger is not affecting how I think I thought about NASA prior to the incident. All right. So I could say like, how did you feel about the space program 5 years ago? And I'd be like, well, I had some concerns about it, and then the Challenger happened. Obviously, the Challenger is going to completely skew my understanding of what I think I felt about NASA prior to the tragedy. Okay, Chapter 8, Survey Research. Survey methods date back to the Roman times, ancient Egypt, medieval Europe. This has been going on for a long time. It's used to take the census. Story. This is like the worst. I tried to find like the worst picture of Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus here. But the story of baby Jesus, like this was all about taking a census. They had to leave where they were and travel to the homeland of Joseph in order to have the baby. So that's the story of Christmas, right? The Romans are going to take a census, so it's like go back to where you live because Rome's going to come through and take a census. And they did this thing for like taxation. They want to know like how many people are living in each area, so that they can send like lords and generals and everybody else there to sort of run the political atmosphere of the place, as well as tax it, right? It's used to map demographics, right? If I have a large kingdom, if I'm the Roman Empire, I want to know how many people are living in each area of my empire, all right? Survey methods, they also ask questions about beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors across a population. In the United States, we do a census. There was the 2020 census. I think it got extended for like a year because of COVID. Obviously, COVID is screwing up a lot of stuff. But in the Constitution, it says, we're supposed to take a census every 10 years. And this is all for redistricting with regard to Congress. Each congressional representative represents about 700,000 people. But obviously people move. So every 10 years they do a new census because I think like right now it's estimated that like California is going to lose 2 representatives because so many people have moved out of California. Texas is going to gain a couple seats in Congress because more people have moved to Texas. So as people move around, we need to know each congressional representative is supposed to represent about 700,000 people. And if people move, we track them through a census and then we sort of redistrict and figure out, who represents what areas. All right. They gather information about large populations, right? Public opinion research, we do political polls, market research, what brands do you want to buy, and evaluation research with regard to like, how well did we do? Tell us how we did. Exit polling, we talked a little bit about this last time as far as random samples as well as systemic ordinal samples. Exit polling for political polls happens, you go in, you vote, you come out the door, and at a lot of polling stations, there's somebody there who is counting the people that come out, and someone just tells them, their boss, ask every nth person, and they give them a number, every 9th person, every 10th person, right? Every 14th person, right? Every person that comes out the door, they might ask them a list of questions, and maybe 10 questions. They might ask them like, what's your age? What's your race? What's your gender? How much income do you make? Who'd you vote for? Right? And then they'll say like, so let's say that someone comes out and they say, I voted for Trump, but then so like they have the hard, like the vote that matters, right? It's like, I voted for Trump, but then they might ask them questions like, well, who do you think is more trustworthy? And the person might say like, well, I think Joe Biden's more trustworthy. And so this becomes an interesting difference in like for pollsters, because they're like, well, Donald Trump got the vote, even though a lot of people thought Biden was more trustworthy, right? Um, so these are questions that are asked to every, whatever the boss says, but every 10th person that comes out of the polling, right? So this is why on election night, the news can report X amount of people, voted for whoever, even though all the ballots aren't counted yet. So ballots are never counted on election night, never, never, never. But based on exit polling, they make a pretty good guess as to who is probably going to win the election on election night. And then they can also tell you, okay, Biden won X amount of the black vote, and Trump won X amount of the men vote, and Biden won X amount of people who make over $100,000, and Trump won X amount of people who make under $50,000, right? These are all these interesting statistics that come in for a couple of days, and it's all based on exit polling, right? Because they have no idea like how much money you make just by who goes to the polls and votes. All right. Um, so something that interesting that happened in 2016. This is probably pretty high, but the number was more than 50%. But people would say, like, obviously Hillary Clinton won the nomination in 2016, but they asked Democrats coming out of the voting booth, it's like, who do you think is more trustworthy? And close, like, it's somewhere like 80, 90% of people are like, I think Bernie Sanders is more trustworthy. I trust Bernie Sanders more, right? But they voted for Hillary Clinton. So this becomes really interesting as Hillary Clinton is getting ready for the 2016 general election against Donald Trump, because she knows now, okay, people voted for me, but they don't think I'm as trustworthy as this other guy. So she knows that she has to sort of boost her trustworthiness with the general population before the voting, right? So there are these numbers that seem counterintuitive with regard to who people vote for versus things like, who do you think is trustworthy? Who do you think has a better personality? Who do you think is like a part of the political establishment? Who do you think the outsider is? Right? These sorts of questions. All right. Again, they don't ask every voter. They just took a sample that is representative of the voting population by, again, every 10th person that comes out of the voting booth. It's like, excuse me, can I ask you a few questions? All right, we do have things such that we call cross-level interference. These are problems that happen. All right. So cross-level interference is assuming that your sample population, or excuse me, your sample size represents a larger population. So go back to things like internal and external validity, which we talked about in the last PowerPoint. So again, you want to make sure that the generalized numbers that you're putting out there can actually be generalized to the larger population, and you're not just talking about the people within your survey, the internal validity. So again, if you want to do a survey on smoking, and you only are interviewing college students, you can't say that, these are smoking trends in the United States. It's like, no, you can probably say that these are smoking trends among college students. All right. When people do, this becomes a big issue. We can get back to like the race discussion. Obviously, it's big in the country at the moment. When people do surveys on their college campus and they say things like, race is a huge problem, and it's like, let's say race is a big problem on college campuses, right? There's a big like racial climate problem on college campuses. When really like the more accurate thing is like there might be a racial climate problem on your campus, right? Or specific types of campuses that you did your surveys at. But there's 330 million people in this country across lots of geographical landscapes in very diverse neighborhoods all over the United States. So you don't want to act as if one survey you did is a stand-in for all of the American college students, unless you did a random sample from every college student from California to New York City and everywhere in between. All right. So you want to make sure that you're actually addressing it. Okay. Some other ways that cross-level interference can happen is sometimes you notice that when you do things like family communication, that moms and dads are given different answers than sons and daughters, right? So the cross-level interference is that people are reporting the same situation differently, even though they all shared in that same situation. All right. This is what's called an ecological fallacy, right? So, for instance, you and your parents might have had the sex talk when you were, 12 or 13 years old, right? And researchers go in there and they say, okay, let's talk about how family communication works with regard to the sex talk when kids are going through puberty. I'm guessing that kids and parents are probably interpreting that event differently, especially if you're doing that research when the kid is now in college, so it's close to 7, 8, 10 years later. All right. People are misremembering things. And also you have to remember, like, mom and dad are in a very different situation with regard to talking about sex than some 12-year-old is with regard to talking about sex. So the 12-year-old might be very uncomfortable. Mom and dad might be just very comfortable with the talk because they've been dealing with this issue of sex pretty openly for years, right? Mom and dad might be very, very embarrassed, right? And the kid might be sitting there listening to mom and dad be like, yeah, we've talked about this in school already. I know everything. Actually, on the side, I have like a secret boyfriend or girlfriend that mom and dad doesn't know about, right? So the kid might already know more than mom and dad know about. So this is how sort of you can have cross-level interference. So if you go around and you want to know, like, how do families interpret the sex talk? The people within who are having that same conversation might interpret the conversation drastically differently. And so you're going to have different results that, they might not match up. You can't really say, like, family communication is great or family communication is bad, because it might be both good and bad depending on which person within that conversation you're talking to. All right, response rate. This is obviously a problem. Many surveys are done on the internet now, and you have to look at, like, who's most likely to respond. Well, first of all, you have to say, like, who's most likely to have the internet, right? Who's most likely to hang out on the internet in order to get the survey. I have friends who do lots of surveys and they blast it out online. They put it on Facebook. Well, that might be a problem because you might be missing a lot of people within the population who don't use Facebook, right? And so this is a problem, right? You can't collect information from people who don't respond, right? It may be personality difference between, there might be personality differences between people who do respond and who don't respond, all right? So again, if you're just doing online surveys, which is where most surveys are right now, it's probably going to skew younger, right? And depending on where you put those surveys, you put them out on Twitter, do you put them on Instagram, do you put them on Facebook, different demographics of individuals use different social media. And so that's going to skew your results with regard to the population that you're actually surveying, all right? Okay, the other thing to think about, right, as far as like differences of respondents, you have to realize that sometimes your respondents are going to skew heavily towards people who are interested in the topic, all right? So quick little trigger warning, we'll mention the sexual assault one, but I think it's a very important and illuminating topic that really illuminates the problem here with this type of research, all right? So let's talk about happiness first. Let's start on a better note, right? If you're giving out a survey about how happy people are, you have to think, like, maybe only happy people are responding, right? Maybe people who are super depressed. So if you say, like, how happy are students on Penn State Brandywine's campus? Maybe the people who are just really engaged on campus are responding. There might be a lot of students who are not happy, who are depressed, who are lonely, who just don't want to engage at all, and we're not capturing them in the population. So all of a sudden we get these results back and we say, wow, Penn State students are like super happy all the time, but we didn't capture those people who didn't respond. And maybe those people who didn't respond aren't responding because they look at it and they're like, I don't want to do this freaking survey on happiness. I'm not happy right now. All right. Now, on a different side, this is one of the things that this is a difficulty in accurately tracking sexual assault numbers with regard to sexual assault surveys. So if you go out and you're trying to figure out, okay, how many people have been sexually assaulted within a certain demographic over a certain period of time. So if you're looking at college campuses, for instance, one of the things you have to be aware of is, like, who is most likely to be interested in this type of survey? Well, the people who are very interested in tracking sexual assault are people who are survivors of sexual assault or people who know somebody, close friends with someone who's been sexually assaulted. So those people are most likely to fill out these surveys and engage with this topic because it's so close to home to them. So in that regard, there might be a lot of people who see these surveys and they're like, sexual assault, well, there's no problem with that. I'm not going to fill out this stupid survey. I'm not going to respond to this. And they ignore it. There might be a lot of people who are like, this is such an important issue. I'm going to respond to it a lot. And I'm going to get all my friends to respond to it. So now all of a sudden you're skewing heavily towards thinking that there is more sexual assault on campus than there actually is. You can take this with lots of other controversial issues. Issue of like racial climate. If you're a person who's had a bad experience on college campus with regard to the racial climate, you are probably going to skew into that group who's like, we need a survey, we need research about racial climate on this campus. All right, those people are more likely to respond. If you're a person walking around campus and you're like, there's no race problem here, I'm not going to waste my time filling out a survey, you might throw it away, right? So we're not capturing a random sample of everybody, but all of a sudden, samples start to skew towards people who are interested in that topic with regard to like wanting to create some sort of change around the policies that would address those topics. So you want to be careful when looking at response rate. Did you actually get a true random sample, or is your survey skewed a little bit because only people interested in the topic were actually responding to it? All right, so this leads into some other things, right? So only about 65% of people who are asked to complete surveys, right, actually do them. One of it is a time issue. So if you're going like in-depth research and you ask somebody to fill out a 100 questions, Scantron sheet, people are like, I don't have the time for that. So you might have to give them like a $10 Amazon gift card or something, which is, this is all above board. There's plenty of people who, they give out gift cards, or they, give out pizza parties or something for people who complete surveys. Or they enter them into a drawing and they say, well, I can't give everyone a $10 gift card, but you'll be entered into a drawing to get a $100 gift card, all right? And then also privacy. People are really concerned, especially if it's online, right? If you, back in the day, you asked me to fill out a sheet of paper, I don't have to write my name on it, I'll fill out a survey and I'll give it back to you. You will never know that's my survey, right? I put it into an envelope, you don't know who it is. Now people are like, look, I can fill out a survey on Facebook, but I don't trust that Facebook couldn't easily access who filled out that survey. Even though you tell me it's anonymous, it's like we got VPN numbers, like who was logged into that Facebook account when that Facebook survey was taken. So even if people say like this is completely confidential, it's like there's been plenty of data leaks, and it's not that hard to track people with regard to their internet search history, with regard to the surveys that they took and the answers that they gave on that survey. So people don't want to talk about it, right? And same thing is true with phone calls, right? So imagine calling someone and saying, "Who are you voting for president?" Some people are just like, I don't know who you are on the other end of the phone. And if I tell you who I'm voting for president and you don't like that person that I tell you I'm voting for, like, how do I know that's not going to come back to me? All right. So people like privacy. All right. One way to section this off is what's called aggregating data. You need to know this for the test. Write this down. Aggregating data is when you group all of the data together and then present it, so no individual is singled out. So what this would look like, for instance, in a classroom, if I have 20 students in a class, I can come into class and say the class average on the exam was a 70 out of 100. Nobody knows if you got 100% or if you got a 50%, right? But I just aggregated all the data. So everybody knows that the class average was 70, but nobody knows what everybody's individual test score was. All right, so you've aggregated the data, all right? It just adds some confidentiality. Types of studies, know the difference. These are just very common terms, right? This is just like stats garbage stuff, or garbage stuff, stats jargon stuff, excuse me there, all right? Cross-sectional just means it's short term, so you're just taking a picture of a moment. Longitudinal just means it's long term, right? So there are these what's called trend studies, and what they do is they measure behavior over a long period of time, sometimes up to 30 years. There's studies that are going on right now that began in the 1950s, 1960s. And what these studies are doing is like they might take a graduating high school class in 1960, and then they track them the rest of their life. And they try to figure out what are these people still doing. So every 2 or 3 years, the researcher might call people up and say, hey, it's time for us to check in on that study we started when you were 18 years old, right? This isn't uncommon, right? And there's still papers being published on these sort of like longitudinal studies to figure out trends, all right? An accelerated longitudinal study is kind of like a cross between a cross-sectional and longitudinal. What they do is they do short bursts of studies over several age groups. So if they're doing something like how do people age, they don't want to take the time to track one person for 50 years. But if they're looking at like how people of different ages respond to certain stimuli, or like the shopping habits of certain people, they'll say, okay, we're going to do like 25 to 30-year-olds, 30 to 35-year-olds, 35 to 40, all the way up to like 95 to 100-year-olds as far as shopping habits. And then with these small little cross sections, we put them together and we try to guess at how somebody's spending habits might change over the course of their life. All right. That one person that we started studying their spending habits at 25, we don't know if they're actually going to be spending like the 100-year-old today because they're going to have their own changes, but we're going to try to do the best guess we can by this accelerated longitudinal study, right? So I can predict based on what people who are 90 years old, what they're doing today. I can predict that you will probably act similar to people who are 90 years old when you get to be 90 years old because I've done this accelerated longitudinal study. All right, some types of questions you want to avoid because they can give you inaccurate results. All right, the first is what's called forward telescoping. So this just means that sometimes when people answer questions, they think that the past seems a lot more recent than it actually is. So if you ask somebody, tell me about your life when you were 12 years old, and they're like, oh, I remember it like it was yesterday. They're probably forward telescoping, all right, which means that they think that something that happened like 10 years ago just happened like 2 years ago. So you want to make sure that people's timelines are accurate when they're giving you information. Backward telescoping is when people think that the past happened longer ago than it actually did. So again, if you're asking someone to sort of lay out the timeline of their life, they might give you inaccurate information because they think that the past happened a lot longer ago than it actually did, right? So this becomes important again when we're trying to set up a chronological order of how people are moving through life. Sometimes people get the dates wrong and the timeline wrong because they're either forward or backward telescoping, and the past is getting condensed in these weird ways. All right. Double barrel questions, you want to avoid this. This will be on the test. All right. It's asking a question that covers too many topics. All right. So you should only be asking one question at a time. So for instance, if I ask you the question, right, on a scale of 1 to 5, do you agree with this question, right? If I ask you the question, I am comfortable talking to my friends and in public. That's actually two different questions. Because you could say, look, I'm comfortable talking in front of my friends, but I'm not comfortable talking in public. So you look at it and you're like, I don't really know how to answer that, right? Because these are actually two different questions. So you want to make sure you're only asking one question at a time, all right? A loaded question is when it's sort of like leading the person. So, you've heard this on like court shows, like don't lead the witness, right? So you want to make sure that you try to avoid these questions. Try to make the question as open as possible where you're not dropping little hints. So for instance, like, don't you think Biden would make a good president? It's like, I feel like I should say yes because I feel like you're leading me, all right? You could just say like, what do you think about Biden as president, right? It's a more neutral way of asking that question that doesn't feel as loaded, doesn't feel like it's leading. Focus groups are when you take a group of, let's say, 10, 20 people, put them in a room, and they are answering the questions together. The pros of this is that the people in the group are interacting, and they actually might ask each other questions that you didn't think of. The downside of this is there might be people who start to take over the conversation, and then everybody just kind of follows them, so you fall into groupthink. So there might be somebody who's very, very shy in the group, and if I'm a very loud, controlling person in the group, that shy person might just kind of like nod their head and follow along with me, even though they don't believe what I'm responding to in that focus group. And so we're not getting an accurate picture of what the group thinks. We're just getting an accurate picture of what Josh thinks, and he just happens to be loud, so everybody's just kind of following along. All right. But again, the pro is that I might end up saying something that sparks deeper, more interesting conversation than the interviewer would have came up with, right? So there are pros and cons to focus groups. Okay, chapter 9, textual analysis. We're almost done. Okay, so we've talked about these are the three things we're doing in this class, right? Quantitative, qualitative, and rhetorical, right? These are the three ways in which you can do research in the field of comm studies, right? So rhetorical analysis, this is your first paper, and we're going to go over this on Friday when we meet live on Zoom, all right? Qualitative is when you're asking surveys and you're trying to get people's response, right? These are very open questions, like tell me, you're interviewing people. Quantitative is you're measuring with numbers, all right? Quantity, numbers, right? Likert scales, all right? On a scale of 1 to 5, you're adding up numbers, all right? So these are three ways you can do research. I'm a rhetorician, so I do mostly rhetorical analysis. My PhD dissertation, which you will read mostly when you read the book Homelessness, that's out of my PhD dissertation, that was qualitative research. I went around and I interviewed people who were homeless, and they gave me responses. They gave me responses to their situations, all right? I have not published quant research. I obviously teach it. But I've conducted a little bit of it in grad school for just like some like grad school projects, but nothing like big and formal. All right. That's when you go out and you hand out like 500 surveys. Okay. So rhetorical analysis, right? Also known as textual analysis. It's a study of messages and their persuasiveness. Yeah, it's more than just like the ability to speak. You're actually looking at messages and you're trying to figure out, are these messages persuasive or not persuasive? How are they persuasive? It doesn't necessarily have to do with whether or not you like it or not, the speech. So there could be politicians, you're like, I hate this politician. But you start to study them, you're like, wow, this politician's super persuasive. Like they're doing some very interesting things here that are actually making people buy into their brand. Speaking of branding, like the same is true with corporations. There's products that you probably hate. There's corporations you probably hate, but you start looking at their advertisement and you're like, wow, I'm studying their messages and I can see why so many people buy, this brand of food or sneakers or cereal or whatever. All right. You describe the message and then you interpret it. It functions in various ways. All right. So you look for a purpose. What's the purpose of this message? I need to understand the cultural context. So what's the history of the context around us? You evaluate it for the society that is receiving the message. You look at how the theories can connect to the message, and then pedagogical, right? What can the message teach us? All right, know these two differences: classical rhetorical analysis and contemporary rhetorical analysis, right? Classical is just the study of speeches. Most of the time we did this sort of like rhetorical exercise. It was studying the speeches of great politicians and great leaders, right? Abraham Lincoln and MLK, that's what we were studying, all right? Specifically interested in public speeches. Contemporary rhetorical criticism redefines what text is, and it's not just important political speeches. It could also be things like media, right? So I've done lots of papers where I've written about, TV or film or campaigns or like shrines, right? Architecture, there's lots of people who do things, this visual rhetoric, right? They walk around cities and they sort of try to see like how cities are set up with regard to like how does that affect your mood and your attitude and how you feel about the town you're from based on the architecture around you. All right. Environmental kind of stuff. Okay. So contemporary rhetoric just sort of redefines what text can actually mean, and it could mean a movie. It could be an MLK speech, which is obviously persuasive. It could be a movie. The movie persuades you to act in a certain way, right? You are mimicking the behavior of your favorite celebrities, right? So movies are persuasive in that way, and that's another way that we can look at rhetorical analysis. All right, when you do a rhetorical analysis, which you're going to do this for your next paper, we'll talk about it more on Friday, you choose the text, and then based on what the text is highlighting, then you choose your theory, which is the lens at which you look at the text, and then you analyze through that text, right? So this is what I try to tell people. Only stick to like one theory and don't force a theory, right? So for instance, there are people who are, let's say, feminist rhetorical critics, and they look at the world and everything they look in the world, they're just like, I'm going to run this through a feminist lens. I think sexism is everywhere. I think sex is so important and gender is so important. Everything I look at, it's all about feminist rhetorical criticism. Sometimes the problem with that is that people are forcing their theory onto things that their theory doesn't really work for. All right. So you choose your text, and maybe your text is more about classism, right? There's some interesting things going on there with class. If you chose a speech by Bernie Sanders, doing something about class issues would probably be a very interesting analysis. So you can say like, how is Bernie Sanders using, or how does Marxism, right? A Marxist critique would be something with regard to class status. How is it present in this Bernie Sanders speech where he's talking about the minimum wage and unions and healthcare and free college, and like Bernie Sanders is like perfect for a Marxist critique. You don't want to force conversations about gender and sexuality and feminist rhetorical criticism into a Bernie Sanders speech. All right. I'm sure people have done it. I'm sure people have tried to do it. I'm sure people are yelling at the YouTube screen right now telling me that I should always do it. That's fine. The problem with that is when you start forcing conversations that aren't necessarily there, you start to sort of undermine and water down the argument. So allow the text that you choose to tell you what theory is most interesting and applicable. A couple examples of some theories, some types of criticism. One is historical criticism. These are in the textbook, right? So you look at the relationship between the text and the time period in which it was written. Um, you do some sort of oral history, so you analyze interviews from people who lived during a particular experience. There's this famous, I guess you could call him like an anthropologist, ethnographer, Studs Terkel. He wrote a lot of books, and his whole career was just going around interviewing people about various events that were kind of going on in the world. Very famous and well-known individual in the world. Journalism, ethnography, anthropology. He has a lot of books written where he just went around and talked to people and said, "Hey, you were alive during the Great Depression. Tell me about it." All right, and people, he just collected hundreds of stories from the Great Depression, and he creates a book about it, right? As some sort of like oral history. All right. Social movement studies, ideological criticism. So what you're doing is you're analyzing the political and social agendas that are within a speech, right? So if you have, so you could look at like the Black Lives Matter protests from last summer, and sort of look, okay, like what are the ideologies that are present? Like what are keywords that keep coming up? What are policies that keep coming up? How can I analyze this movement, and how does this movement actually want to sort of like make change? All right. So that would be something you could look at with ideological criticism. And then what you could do is you can compare Black Lives Matter movement as an ideology, and you compare it to a different ideology that has a different view for how the world should be set up. All right, genre criticism is what you do is you look to see how this text fits into the genre that it's a part of. My face is covering this up, I apologize, but you look at something like horror films have predictable plots. So if you're doing some sort of like film analysis, you look at the newest horror film and you're like, how does this fit into the horror film genre? And what you start to find with horror films is that horror films are very predictable. If you study them, right, in a certain way, you can kind of figure out like who the killer is or who's going to be killed first or what the plot twist is. A lot of horror films are set up in these very similar patterns. And you can say, oh, this new horror film falls into this type of genre, and I'm going to compare this new horror film to all these other classic horror films that we know. All right. Genre, like, the root word from genre is the same word we get generic, right? So it's a sort of like generic thing. It's predictable. We know where it fits. And I'm going to compare this new thing to all these other old things that are within the same purview. Dramatistic criticism is this Shakespearean idea that all life is a stage. So you look for things like the act, the purpose, the characters in the scene, the agency, the scene itself. So you go into a classroom and you're like, I can predict what's going to happen in the classroom because people are going to act out the classroom as if it's some sort of like drama setting, right? You can predict how your friends are going to interact because there are friends on television who interact in a certain way, and we're just all kind of actors, all the world's a stage kind of situation, all right? So we move through life based on scripts, and so you look at certain situations, you kind of compare them to like, how would this play out if it was a movie, a TV show? Like, what are the predictable qualities of this real life situation based on, what we would see, in a play or a movie? Fantasy themes and myths are all about the stories we tell ourselves. So if you look at like MLK's mountaintop speech, right? Making it to the mountaintop. These are sort of aspirational type speeches. So a lot of like sermons would fall under something like fantasy themes, like where are we going in the future, visions for the future. Rallying a sports team at halftime, visions for the future, right? MLK speech, civil rights speeches, you're looking at like where do we see ourselves in the future. And then finally, Marxist criticism, how are people depicted by class? How does the text uphold different issues of power? So one of the ideas behind Marxism is that texts are created as a way to keep people in their place. So if powerful people create certain text, it doesn't actually change the social status, but certain texts are made by the powerful people. And I'm just going to put out text, so like movies, films, Instagram posts. I'm going to put things out that allow me to stay on top and allow all you minions to stay on the bottom, right? That's what Marxist criticism looks like. There's this new idea that's currently kind of circulating in academia that people are referring to as woke capitalism, which I think is a fantastic term, and I think it perfectly illustrates it. And what it talks about is the way in which all these corporations are capitalizing on things like the BLM protest, Occupy Wall Street, the wokeness of the world, right? And then there's a lot of people, like the social justice people out there, who are applauding, like, yay, Walmart and Apple and Disney, they all did what we wanted. And it's like, they're doing that because you're paying them money. Like, they're not idiots. And at the end of the day, guess what? Like, Nike's still making a lot of money off of you. I know they put Colin Kaepernick in their sneaker commercials, but they didn't do that to lose money. Like, they did it because it was profitable. Um, I was in New York City last summer, and I think it was in June or July, and they were about to do it was like the Gay Pride parade. Gay Pride Month was going on, and you walked in Times Square, and it's like every, Old Navy and Apple and the Gap and everything. Like, it's just pride flags everywhere, like on shirts, on merchandise, and you're like, that's great. Like, I'm, good for them, so for supporting the movement. But you're also like, yeah, you walk into the Gap and they have a gay pride flag on their shirt because they want you to buy it, right? They're not losing money on this stuff. So a Marxist critique of this, like, system would say, look, the powerful people they're just putting out whatever message that all of us are agreeing is the best message of the day because they're trying to sell us stuff, right? And as soon as, like, Occupy Wall Street goes away, the corporations go back to their normal behavior. As soon as Black Lives Matter is not a big protest movement anymore, the corporations will go on to the next thing. As soon as, like, gay pride kind of fizzles out because same-sex marriage has become normalized, it's going to fizzle out and the corporations will go on to the next thing, right? The corporations are just kind of following along with whatever's popular at the moment, woke capitalism, in order to capitalize on the movement, right? They're selling you a shirt and they're still selling you a shirt, and they don't care if they sell it to you by putting Black Lives Matter on it or Blue Lives Matter on it, right? They don't, Disney is making films. They don't care if they have, a princess and a prince. They don't care if they have, like, two sisters, like in Frozen. They don't care. Like, they don't care. Like, they're just making products that people buy, in order for them to keep making money, and that's how it is. All right. So Marxist critique would look at something like that and say, woke capitalism is just very, maybe corporations care about, our social justice issues, but they probably not. But maybe. I don't know. All right. Two more quick slides here. Vernacular rhetoric looks at the ways in which marginalized voices have access to public spaces. So some of you might know Lupe Fiasco, who I enjoy listening to when I'm at the gym. But vernacular rhetoric looks at things like graffiti, dance, poetry, and art as a way of trying to highlight the way in which people with marginalized voices are now in the public sphere, right? So again, you go back to classical rhetorical tradition. It's like Abraham Lincoln and MLK, like important figures. Vernacular rhetoric is like there's a lot of people who have important messages that don't have the political platform of Abraham Lincoln, MLK, Joe Biden, right? And so it looks at sort of like these underground marginal like movements or artwork or creative expression that is marginalized as a productive, persuasive way of trying to get a message out. So you look at something like Lupe Fiasco with like hip hop music, right? And he's like telling a story that's not going to be told by Joe Biden, all right? And then finally, feminist criticism. It looks at male and female roles in society. We will go over Eminem's Love the Way You Lie, which is posted in Canvas for you to read. But really, if you're a feminist critic, you're looking at things like how are men and women depicted in society? Who's responsible for various forms of violence in society? Every time you look at the world, you're like, how does this affect, issues of gender, sexuality, femininity, masculinity, etc. And finally, content analysis. You need to know this for the test. Know this for the test. Quantitative content analysis. Quantitative, numbers. We're still in rhetorical analysis here, but what you could do is you could do a quantitative content analysis within the purview of qualitative or of rhetorical analysis, right? So you count how many times a word, or phrase, or a message is said in a speech, and then you start to realize like that word's probably really important. If you go through Bernie Sanders speeches and he keeps talking about like the minimum wage or free college, you're like, that's probably important to him. All right. Politicians use words like liberty, democracy, fairness, equality, justice, opportunity. It's like these are probably important words. Now our job is to figure out like what is the exact meaning, because you could say fairness and nobody knows what you mean by fairness. So for instance, politicians, they all come out and they say everybody should pay their fair share of taxes with regard to taxes. What's fair share mean? That means everybody pays 10%, 25%, 50%. Does everybody 90%? Right? Do poor people pay 0% and rich people pay 90%? Do rich people pay 25%? Like, do we have a progressive income? Like, nobody gives a straight definition of this. So you go and you say, wow, everybody wants fairness and equality, but your job as the researcher is to dig into the numbers and say, what do people actually mean by fairness? All right. Everybody says fairness and justice and opportunity. We all want a better future for our kids. What's your policy? That's where you get in. All right. Qualitative content analysis, you're interested in the meanings behind the message. So you're not counting the words. You're trying to get a subjective understanding of what the actual message is. So again, we'll go over this Eminem video, Love the Way You Lie. And you can say, does it have a good message or a bad message based on your interpretation of the message? Okay, that was a lot. I know it's 3 chapters, but we got through them, and I will see you all on Friday, and we will discuss your next paper.